In the dense jungle of Vietnam, numerical superiority held a different meaning than it did on the open battlefields of earlier wars. The vegetation was so thick that a soldier could stand 10 meters from an enemy position and see nothing but shadow and leaves. The canopy overhead filtered sunlight into a perpetual twilight, and the undergrowth grew so dense that movement required machetes and constant effort. In this environment, a force of 30 men could effectively pin down a unit twice its size simply by controlling key terrain and maintaining concealment. The advantages that mechanized units and air support provided in open terrain were reduced or negated entirely beneath the jungle canopy. Radio communication became unreliable. Visual confirmation of enemy positions was nearly impossible. Artillery support required precise coordinates that were difficult to obtain when landmarks were obscured by vegetation. The North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong forces understood these limitations intimately and structured their tactics accordingly. They moved in small groups, established supply caches in concealed locations, and avoided direct engagement unless the tactical situation favored them. When they did choose to fight, they often did so from prepared positions that allowed them to control the tempo and duration of contact. American forces, by contrast, were frequently tasked with locating and engaging an enemy that could dissolve into the jungle within minutes of initiating contact. This created a persistent imbalance in which U.S. units operated in unfamiliar terrain while their adversaries moved through the same jungle with practiced efficiency. The psychological dimension of operating in such an environment cannot be understated. Soldiers trained in conventional tactics found themselves in a war where the enemy rarely presented a clear target. Ambushes could occur at any moment, and the inability to see more than a few meters in any direction meant that situational awareness was severely degraded. The sounds of the jungle itself, the constant hum of insects, the calls of birds, and the rustling of leaves made it difficult to detect human movement. Men learned to distinguish between natural sounds and those that might indicate the presence of an adversary, but this required experience and a level of attentiveness that was exhausting to maintain over extended periods. The heat was oppressive, with temperatures regularly exceeding 90 degrees Fahrenheit and humidity levels that made breathing feel labored. Uniforms soaked through with sweat within minutes of movement, and the weight of equipment, rifles, ammunition, radios, and supplies added to the physical strain. Dehydration was a constant concern, and water sources were often contaminated or located in areas that required significant exposure to reach. Malaria, dysentery, and infections from minor cuts were common. The jungle was not simply a battlefield, it was an environment that actively worked against human endurance. In the spring of 1968, a reinforced rifle company from the 25th Infantry Division was conducting search and clear operations in a contested region roughly 40 kilometers northwest of Cu Chi. The unit consisted of approximately 120 men organized into 3 rifle platoons, a weapons platoon, and a small command element. Their mission was to locate and disrupt enemy supply routes that intelligence assessments indicated were being used to move material into the region. The area of operations was characterized by dense primary jungle, interspersed with bamboo thickets and occasional clearings that had been created by previous artillery strikes or aerial bombing. The terrain was uneven, with shallow ravines, small streams, and patches of swamp that made movement slow and unpredictable. The company had been in the field for 6 days and had encountered minimal contact. Patrols had discovered recently used trails and evidence of enemy activity, including discarded equipment and old cooking fires, but no direct engagement had occurred. This was not unusual. Many operations in Vietnam involved extended periods of movement and observation with only sporadic contact. The challenge lay in maintaining readiness and discipline during these periods of apparent inactivity, knowing that the situation could change with little warning. On the morning of the 7th day, the company was moving in a dispersed column along a trail that intelligence reports suggested led toward a suspected supply cache. The lead platoon was approximately 70 meters ahead of the main body, with point elements advancing cautiously and checking the trail for signs of mines or booby traps. The remaining platoons followed at intervals designed to prevent the entire unit from being caught in a single ambush while still maintaining mutual support. Radio communication between platoons was maintained at regular intervals, and the company commander remained positioned near the center of the column where he could coordinate movement and respond to contact from any direction. The march was slow. The point element would advance a few meters, pause to observe, and then continue. This pattern repeated itself continuously, and progress was measured in hundreds of meters rather than kilometers. The soldiers moved in near silence, communicating with hand signals and keeping verbal exchanges to a minimum. The jungle around them was quiet, though not unnaturally so. Birds called from the canopy, and the sound of insects was constant. There was no indication that the area was occupied by hostile forces. At approximately 1000 hours, the lead platoon reported movement to the northeast. The sighting was brief, a figure moving through the undergrowth at a distance estimated to be 50 to 70 meters. The figure disappeared before positive identification could be made. The company commander ordered the column to halt and deployed the lead platoon into a defensive posture facing the direction of the sighting. The remaining platoons adjusted their positions to provide security to the flanks and rear. For the next 20 minutes, the unit remained stationary while the lead platoon conducted a limited sweep of the area where the movement had been observed. They found a trail, recently used, with footprints that appeared to be fresh. There was no other evidence of enemy presence. The company commander assessed the situation and made the decision to continue the mission. The column reformed and resumed movement, but with heightened alertness. The point element slowed its pace further, and soldiers scanned the jungle with increased intensity. The terrain ahead began to slope downward into a shallow depression, and the vegetation thickened. Visibility dropped to less than 10 meters in some areas, and the undergrowth became so dense that forward observers had difficulty maintaining visual contact with the rest of their squad. As the lead platoon descended into the depression, rifle fire erupted from multiple directions. The initial burst was short, perhaps 5 or 6 rounds, followed by a pause and then sustained fire from automatic weapons. The point squad immediately went to ground and returned fire, though they could not identify specific targets. The volume of incoming fire suggested that the enemy force was small, perhaps a squad-sized element, but the firing positions were well concealed, and the muzzle flashes were difficult to pinpoint in the shadows. The platoon leader radioed contact and requested support from the company commander. The remaining platoons moved forward cautiously, deploying to the flanks to prevent encirclement and to establish fields of fire. The engagement continued for several minutes, with bursts of fire exchanged sporadically. The company commander attempted to call for artillery support, but the density of the canopy and the proximity of the enemy positions made accurate fire missions difficult to coordinate. He directed the weapons platoon to set up a base of fire on a slight rise to the west, where they could provide covering fire for the engaged platoon. The situation appeared to be a standard contact scenario, and the initial assessment was that the enemy would disengage and withdraw once they faced organized resistance. However, as the weapons platoon moved into position, they began receiving fire from their flank. This fire came from the south, a direction that had previously been clear. The incoming rounds were sporadic but accurate enough to force the platoon to halt and return fire. Almost simultaneously, the rear security element reported movement to their east. What had initially appeared to be a small contact with a single enemy element was now developing into something more complex. The company commander recognized that his unit was beginning to be engaged from multiple directions and that the enemy force was larger than initial contact had suggested. He ordered the platoons to consolidate into a tighter perimeter and to cease forward movement. The priority shifted from continuing the mission to establishing a defensive position that could be held until the tactical situation became clearer. The soldiers moved quickly but without panic, falling back in coordinated bounds while maintaining suppressive fire toward known or suspected enemy positions. The terrain worked against them. The depression they had entered was surrounded by slightly higher ground on 3 sides, and the thick vegetation limited their ability to identify covered routes of withdrawal. Within 15 minutes of the initial contact, the company had contracted into a circular defensive perimeter, roughly 60 meters in diameter. The position was not ideal. There were no significant terrain features that provided natural protection, and the vegetation, while offering concealment, also restricted visibility and limited the effectiveness of their fields of fire. The company commander established his command post near the center of the perimeter and began assessing the situation. Radio communication with battalion headquarters was maintained, but the signal was weak and transmission quality was poor. He reported that his unit was in contact with an enemy force of unknown size and that he was establishing a defensive perimeter pending further assessment. He requested immediate air support and artillery preparation of suspected enemy positions, but both requests were subject to delays due to availability and coordination requirements. The situation was not yet critical, but it was deteriorating. Incoming fire continued from multiple directions, though it remained sporadic and was not yet concentrated enough to suggest an imminent assault. The soldiers dug shallow fighting positions using entrenching tools and whatever natural cover was available. Ammunition was redistributed to ensure that each position had adequate supplies, and medics moved through the perimeter checking for casualties. 2 men had been wounded during the initial contact, both with minor injuries, and they were treated and returned to their positions. As the afternoon progressed, the pattern of enemy fire began to change. Instead of sporadic bursts, the incoming rounds became more sustained and appeared to be coming from fixed positions rather than mobile elements. The North Vietnamese forces were not attacking directly, but were maintaining pressure on the perimeter from concealed positions that allowed them to fire with relative impunity. American soldiers returned fire whenever they identified a target, but the effectiveness of their response was limited by the lack of clear sight lines. Ammunition expenditure became a concern. The company had begun the day with standard combat loads, but sustained firefights in the jungle could deplete ammunition reserves quickly, particularly if fire discipline was not maintained. The company commander issued orders that all fire was to be aimed and controlled. Soldiers were instructed not to engage suspected positions unless they had positive identification of a target or unless directed to do so by their squad leaders. This discipline was critical. In the jungle, the temptation to fire at every sound or movement could lead to wasted ammunition and reduced effectiveness when accurate fire was actually needed. By mid-afternoon, it became apparent that the company was effectively surrounded. Patrols sent to probe potential routes of withdrawal reported contact in all directions, and the volume of fire increased whenever movement was detected. The enemy was not massing for an assault, but neither were they disengaging. They were maintaining contact and applying pressure, a tactic designed to fix the American unit in place and exhaust their resources. The company commander updated battalion headquarters and provided a detailed assessment of the situation. He estimated that his unit was facing an enemy force of at least 2 companies, possibly more, and that the enemy held advantageous terrain on all sides of the perimeter. He requested immediate helicopter extraction, but the request was denied due to the inability to secure a landing zone under fire. The nearest clearing that could accommodate helicopters was more than 300 meters away, and reaching it would require the company to fight through established enemy positions. Artillery support was approved, but the fire missions had to be carefully coordinated to avoid striking the American perimeter. Forward observers worked with the Fire Direction Center to plot concentrations around the perimeter, particularly in areas where enemy activity was heaviest. The first artillery rounds began impacting approximately 200 meters to the north, and adjustments were made based on observed fall of shot. The artillery provided some relief, forcing enemy elements to withdraw from their most forward positions, but it did not break contact entirely. As evening approached, the company prepared for the possibility of a night assault. Defensive positions were reinforced, and listening posts were established at the edge of the perimeter to provide early warning of enemy movement. Soldiers were placed on rotating watch schedules to ensure that the perimeter remained alert throughout the night while still allowing men to rest. The jungle grew darker as the sun set, and visibility dropped to nearly zero. Soldiers relied on sound and occasional illumination from flares dropped by aircraft to monitor the area beyond the perimeter. The enemy did not attack during the night, but they maintained sporadic harassment fire that kept the defenders awake and on edge. The sound of movement could be heard in the darkness, the snap of branches and the rustle of leaves, but no targets presented themselves. Illumination rounds fired by supporting artillery lit the jungle in stark white light for brief moments, casting long shadows and creating the illusion of movement where none existed. The psychological strain of this environment was significant. Soldiers strained to hear and interpret every sound, knowing that an attack could come from any direction at any moment. The discipline and training of the unit became evident during these hours. There was no panic, no breaking of the perimeter, and no unauthorized movement. Each man remained in his assigned position and maintained his sector of responsibility. The night passed slowly, and dawn brought a gradual return of visibility. The enemy fire resumed shortly after first light, though it remained limited to sporadic bursts from concealed positions. The company conducted a head count and assessed their situation. No additional casualties had been sustained during the night, and ammunition levels, while reduced, remained adequate if fire discipline continued to be maintained. Water was becoming a concern. The soldiers had consumed most of their canteen supplies during the previous day, and the heat was already building as the sun rose. The company commander requested a resupply drop, but the density of the canopy made parachute drops unreliable. Supplies would have to be delivered by helicopter, and that required the establishment of a secure landing zone. The decision was made to attempt a limited breakout toward a clearing that had been identified on maps as being approximately 400 meters to the southeast. The movement would be conducted in stages, with one platoon establishing security while the others moved, then leapfrogging forward in controlled bounds. The objective was not to engage the enemy directly, but to disengage from the current position and reach a location where extraction or resupply could be conducted more effectively. The breakout began in the early morning hours. The lead platoon moved first, advancing slowly and maintaining tight control over spacing and intervals. They made contact almost immediately. Enemy forces had anticipated the movement and had positioned themselves along the most likely routes. The engagement was sharp but brief. The platoon returned fire and established a base of fire while the company commander assessed whether to continue the movement or withdraw back to the perimeter. After consulting with his platoon leaders, he made the decision to continue. The alternative was to remain in the current position, and that would only allow the enemy to maintain the initiative. The company advanced in coordinated bounds, with each platoon providing covering fire for the movement of the others. Progress was measured in meters. Every 10 or 15 meters gained required a pause to suppress enemy fire and ensure that the flanks remained secure. The enemy was not attempting to overrun the American position, but was instead conducting a fighting withdrawal, maintaining contact while gradually falling back. This was a deliberate tactic. By maintaining pressure without committing to a decisive engagement, the North Vietnamese forces were forcing the Americans to expend ammunition and energy while avoiding significant casualties themselves. By midday, the company had advanced approximately 200 meters. The effort had cost them 2 additional wounded, both from small arms fire, and ammunition reserves were now becoming critically low. The company commander halted the advance and ordered the unit to establish a hasty defensive position. He radioed battalion headquarters and reported the situation. The battalion commander authorized the continuation of the movement and confirmed that helicopter support would be available once the company reached the clearing. Air support was also scrambled, and within 30 minutes, 2 attack helicopters arrived on station. The helicopters made gun runs along the flanks of the American position, suppressing enemy fire and allowing the company to resume movement. The presence of the helicopters changed the dynamic of the engagement. The enemy fire slackened noticeably, and the rate of advance increased. The company covered the remaining distance to the clearing in less than an hour, establishing a perimeter around the landing zone and securing it for the arrival of transport helicopters. The extraction was conducted in stages, with the wounded being evacuated first, followed by the remainder of the company. Enemy fire continued sporadically during the extraction, but it was not heavy enough to prevent the helicopters from landing and taking off. By late afternoon, the entire company had been extracted and returned to the battalion base. The operation had lasted approximately 36 hours from the initial contact to the final extraction. The company had sustained 4 wounded and no killed, though several men had suffered from heat exhaustion and required medical evaluation. The enemy force was estimated to have numbered between 200 and 300 personnel, organized into at least 2 companies with supporting elements. Captured documents and subsequent intelligence assessments indicated that the North Vietnamese unit had been tasked with defending the supply route and had been monitoring American movements for several days prior to the engagement. The decision to ambush the company had been deliberate, and the subsequent encirclement had been conducted according to standard North Vietnamese tactics designed to isolate American units and inflict casualties through sustained pressure rather than direct assault. The fact that the American company had survived intact was attributed to several factors. The soldiers had maintained fire discipline throughout the engagement, conserving ammunition and ensuring that their defensive perimeter remained intact. Leadership at all levels, from the company commander down to squad leaders, had remained calm and had made decisions based on tactical assessments, rather than emotional reactions. The training that the soldiers had received prior to deployment had prepared them for the realities of jungle warfare, and they had applied that training effectively under conditions of significant stress and uncertainty. The experience of this company was not unique. Throughout the Vietnam War, American units frequently found themselves outnumbered and surrounded in terrain that favored the enemy. The jungle environment negated many of the technological and material advantages that U.S. forces possessed, reducing engagements to contests of endurance, discipline, and small unit tactics. Survival in such situations depended on the ability of soldiers to remain cohesive under pressure, to conserve resources, and to avoid actions that would escalate the engagement beyond their ability to control. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces understood that they could not defeat American units in direct, sustained combat. Their strategy was to engage American forces in situations where the advantages of firepower and mobility were minimized, to inflict casualties, and to withdraw before the full weight of American support could be brought to bear. This strategy required patience, detailed planning, and intimate knowledge of the terrain. It also required a willingness to accept casualties in pursuit of strategic objectives. American forces, by contrast, were often operating with limited intelligence, in unfamiliar terrain, and under operational constraints that prioritized minimizing casualties and maintaining unit cohesion. The challenge was to conduct offensive operations while avoiding situations that played to the enemy's strengths. The lessons learned from engagements such as the one described were incorporated into training and tactical doctrine as the war progressed. Units began placing greater emphasis on reconnaissance and intelligence gathering prior to operations. Helicopter insertions were conducted with greater attention to securing landing zones and establishing defensive perimeters before advancing into contested areas. Artillery and air support were pre-positioned and coordinated more effectively to provide rapid response when units made contact. Fire discipline and ammunition conservation became central components of training, and soldiers were taught to distinguish between situations that required aggressive fire and those that required restraint. Small unit leaders were given greater autonomy to make tactical decisions based on conditions on the ground, rather than adhering rigidly to pre-planned operations. The importance of maintaining communication and cohesion within units was emphasized, as was the need for soldiers to trust their training and their leaders even in situations of significant uncertainty and danger. The psychological dimensions of operating in an environment where the enemy held the initiative were also recognized. Soldiers were trained to manage fear and stress, to maintain focus during extended periods of inactivity, and to respond to sudden contact without panic. The strain of operating under these conditions was considerable, and not all soldiers adapted equally well. Some struggled with the constant uncertainty and the lack of clear objectives. Others found that their training and the support of their unit provided the structure they needed to function effectively. The experience of being surrounded and outnumbered in the jungle was one that tested the limits of individual and collective endurance. It revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of American military training and doctrine, and it provided hard-earned lessons that would influence how military forces approached asymmetric warfare in the decades that followed. In analyzing such engagements, it is important to avoid oversimplifying the factors that determined outcomes. The survival of units like the one described was not the result of superior courage or skill alone, nor was it simply a matter of superior firepower or technology. It was the product of a complex interaction between training, leadership, terrain, enemy tactics, and the availability of supporting assets. In some cases, American units were able to extract themselves from encirclement through aggressive action and coordinated movement. In other cases, survival depended on establishing a strong defensive position and holding it until support arrived. There was no single formula for success, and the tactics that worked in one situation might prove ineffective in another. What remained constant was the need for discipline, adaptability, and the ability to make decisions under conditions of extreme stress and incomplete information. The role of supporting arms in these engagements cannot be overstated. Artillery fire provided a means of suppressing enemy positions and forcing them to withdraw or take cover. Helicopter gunships and close air support offered mobile firepower that could be directed against enemy concentrations with relative precision. Medical evacuation helicopters ensured that wounded soldiers could be removed from the battlefield and treated quickly, improving survival rates and maintaining morale. Communication equipment allowed isolated units to coordinate with higher command and to call for support when needed. All of these assets were essential, but they were not always available when needed, and they were not always effective in the jungle environment. Artillery fire could be delayed by coordination requirements or by the need to avoid hitting friendly forces. Helicopters could be grounded by weather or by heavy enemy fire. Radio communication could be disrupted by terrain or by equipment failure. American units had to be prepared to operate without these assets, at least temporarily, and to rely on their own resources and training to survive. The experience of being surrounded in the jungle also highlighted the importance of pre-mission planning and intelligence. Units that entered contested areas with detailed knowledge of the terrain, enemy dispositions, and likely courses of action were better prepared to respond when contact occurred. Reconnaissance patrols, aerial surveillance, and signals intelligence all contributed to building a picture of enemy activity, but this information was often incomplete or out of date. The enemy was mobile, and positions that were occupied one day might be abandoned the next. Supply routes that were active during one period might be dormant during another. American units had to operate with an understanding that their information was imperfect and that they might encounter situations that were significantly different from what had been anticipated. This required a level of flexibility and adaptability that was not always present in conventional military operations. It also required leaders who were capable of making rapid assessments and adjusting plans based on changing conditions. The mental and physical toll of extended operations in the jungle was significant. Soldiers operated under conditions of constant stress, poor nutrition, inadequate sleep, and exposure to disease. The heat and humidity were debilitating, and the weight of equipment made movement exhausting. The psychological strain of knowing that contact could occur at any moment, combined with the inability to see or clearly identify the enemy, created a state of heightened alertness that was difficult to sustain over long periods. Soldiers learned to manage this stress in various ways. Some relied on humor and camaraderie with their fellow soldiers. Others found solace in routine and in the structure provided by military discipline. Still others struggled and required support from medics, chaplains, or their unit leaders. The ability of a unit to maintain cohesion and effectiveness over extended operations depended in large part on the strength of the relationships between soldiers and the quality of leadership at all levels. In the broader context of the Vietnam War, engagements like the one described were part of a larger pattern of conflict in which neither side was able to achieve a decisive advantage. American forces possessed superior firepower, mobility, and logistical support, but they were operating in an environment that negated many of these advantages and against an enemy that was highly adaptive and willing to accept significant casualties in pursuit of its objectives. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces could not defeat American units in conventional engagements, but they could impose a steady toll of casualties and force American units to operate under conditions of constant uncertainty and danger. The result was a war of attrition, in which the measure of success was often simply survival and the ability to continue operations. For the soldiers on the ground, the experience of being surrounded and outnumbered was a test of their training, their discipline, and their ability to function as part of a cohesive unit under extreme conditions. Many passed that test as evidenced by their survival and their continued service. Others did not, and the cost of the war in terms of casualties, both physical and psychological, was substantial. The legacy of these experiences extends beyond the Vietnam War itself. The lessons learned about small unit tactics, the importance of fire discipline, the challenges of operating in complex terrain, and the need for adaptability in the face of an unconventional enemy have informed military training and doctrine in the decades since. The concept of counterinsurgency, the emphasis on cultural awareness and population-centric operations, and the recognition that military force alone cannot achieve political objectives all have roots in the experiences of units that fought in Vietnam. The soldiers who survived engagements like the one described carried those lessons forward, some as instructors, others as leaders in subsequent conflicts, and still others as civilians who sought to ensure that the sacrifices of their generation were not forgotten. The question of whether the war itself was justified or whether the strategies employed were effective remains a matter of debate. What is not debatable is that the soldiers who fought in the jungles of Vietnam faced extraordinary challenges, and that many of them demonstrated remarkable courage, discipline, and resilience in the face of those challenges. The specifics of individual engagements varied widely. Some units were surrounded for hours, others for days. Some were able to break out and reach safety, while others required rescue or extraction under fire. Some suffered significant casualties, while others emerged relatively intact. The common thread was the challenge of maintaining cohesion and effectiveness when outnumbered, in unfamiliar terrain, and against an enemy that controlled the tempo of the engagement. American military doctrine had been developed for conventional warfare in Europe, where clear lines of advance, identifiable objectives, and large-scale formations were the norm. Vietnam required a different approach, one that emphasized small unit independence, rapid decision-making, and the ability to operate without clear guidance from higher command. This transition was not always smooth, and there were units that struggled to adapt. Those that did adapt, however, demonstrated that even under the most challenging conditions, well-trained and disciplined soldiers could survive and continue to function effectively. The narrative of American forces in Vietnam is often framed in terms of technological superiority and overwhelming firepower, and while these factors were certainly present, they were not determinative in the jungle environment. The soldiers who fought there understood that their survival depended as much on their ability to read the terrain, to anticipate enemy actions, and to maintain discipline under fire as it did on the weapons they carried or the support they could call upon. The jungle was an environment that humbled even the most experienced soldiers, and that demanded constant vigilance and adaptability. For those who survived, the experience left a lasting mark. They learned that war was not a matter of simple heroics or clear victories, but rather a grinding test of endurance in which success was often measured in the ability to survive another day and to continue the mission. The soldiers who were surrounded and outnumbered in the jungles of Vietnam faced one of the most difficult challenges that any military force can encounter, and the fact that so many of them survived is a testament to their training, their discipline, and their resilience. The engagements that took place in the Vietnamese jungle were not the product of dramatic last stands or miraculous interventions. They were the result of ordinary soldiers doing their jobs under extraordinary circumstances. They maintained their positions when withdrawal seemed impossible. They conserved ammunition when the temptation was to fire at every shadow. They trusted their training and their leaders when fear and exhaustion threatened to overwhelm them. They worked together as units, supporting each other and maintaining cohesion even when the situation seemed hopeless. This is not to romanticize their experience or to minimize the horror and brutality of the war. Many soldiers died in Vietnam, and many more were wounded or psychologically scarred by their experiences. The war itself remains controversial, and the strategic decisions that led to American involvement and the conduct of the war have been the subject of extensive debate and criticism. But for the soldiers who found themselves surrounded and outnumbered in the jungle, the question was not whether the war was justified or whether the strategy was sound. The question was how to survive the next hour, the next day, and how to ensure that their fellow soldiers survived as well. In examining these engagements, it is essential to maintain a focus on the tactical and operational realities rather than allowing the narrative to be shaped by political or ideological considerations. The soldiers who fought in Vietnam were not policymakers, and they did not choose the terrain or the enemy they faced. They were professionals who executed their orders to the best of their ability under some of the most challenging conditions imaginable. The fact that they were often outnumbered and surrounded was not a reflection of their competence or their courage, but rather a consequence of the strategic and operational environment in which they were operating. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces were highly capable adversaries who understood the terrain and who employed tactics that were well suited to the environment. American forces had to learn to counter these tactics, and that learning process was often painful and costly. The soldiers who survived those lessons carried them forward, and their experiences contributed to a broader understanding of how to conduct operations in complex, unconventional environments. The reality of being surrounded in the jungle was that it was not a situation that could be resolved through aggression or bold action alone. It required patience, discipline, and the ability to make calculated decisions based on incomplete information. It required soldiers to trust that their leaders were making the right choices and that support would arrive when needed. It required leaders to remain calm and focused even when the situation was deteriorating and when the lives of their soldiers hung in the balance. It required coordination between multiple units and supporting assets, often under conditions where communication was difficult and where the tactical situation was changing rapidly. It required, above all, the ability to endure. The jungle did not yield to those who sought to impose their will upon it. It required adaptation, respect, and a recognition that survival depended as much on avoiding mistakes as it did on making bold moves. The soldiers who experienced these engagements came home with a perspective that was shaped by their time in the jungle. They understood that war was not a matter of clear victories or decisive battles. but rather a series of small actions and decisions that accumulated over time. They understood that technology and firepower could not guarantee success, and that the human elements of training, discipline, and leadership were often more important than material advantages. They understood that the enemy they had faced was formidable, and that the jungle itself was as much an adversary as the soldiers who moved through it. These lessons were hard-won, and they came at a significant cost. But they were lessons that would shape military thinking for decades to come, and that would inform how future generations of soldiers were trained and prepared for combat. The story of how U.S. troops survived when surrounded and outnumbered in the Vietnam jungle is not a story of dramatic heroism or miraculous escapes. It is a story of ordinary men doing their jobs under extraordinary circumstances. It is a story of discipline and training overcoming fear and uncertainty. It is a story of leaders making difficult decisions and soldiers trusting those decisions even when the outcome was unclear. It is a story that reflects both the strengths and the limitations of military power, and that illustrates the profound challenges of conducting operations in an environment where the enemy holds the initiative and where the terrain itself is hostile. It is a story that deserves to be told with accuracy and respect, focusing on the tactical and operational realities, rather than on dramatic narratives or idealized portrayals. The soldiers who fought in the jungles of Vietnam faced challenges that few can fully comprehend, and their ability to survive and continue their mission under such conditions stands as a testament to the resilience and professionalism of the American soldier. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe and write in the comments what the next video should be about.